Don't get insulted. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Welcome to SCI-Arc. Friedrich Nietzsche, that famous urban strategist, once directed us to build our cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. How is that admonition useful to the history of architecture? Architecture is often a solitary subject on a long list of solitary subjects. On occasion, architecture transcends its solitary limits and subsumes that long list. When it does, architecture can transform culture. That means that architecture becomes not simply the confirmation of a broader historic pattern, but the initiator of that pattern. The discourse that advances, the discourse that advances the history of architecture beyond a simple chronology of buildings is an old one. Its authors are cartographers of culture, mapping history as best they can, knowing that map will inevitably be redrawn. We write history, and history becomes the history we write. And Tolstoy has told us history would be an excellent thing if only it were true. Jean-Louis Cohen may confirm Tolstoy's remark. Today, the arbiters of culture are often referred to as historians or theorists or critics. Jean-Louis Cohen rejects those labels, but he has repositioned architecture as an essential part of an evolving historic puzzle, which he assembles while simultaneously inventing the pieces. The best, Mumford debunking the myth of the machine, Nietzsche with his contempt for the flies of the contemporary marketplace, Elias Canetti with his analysis of abusive crowds and power, Thucydides on life and death in Pericles' funeral oration. The best create the narratives we require to manage the world conceptually. Are these theories intrinsically so? Do they tell us who we are, in fact, or do they prescribe our aspirations? Do our options exist only within the history we write, or are there options available to us in the history not yet written? Do we require a chronology or a sequence or a cycle to locate ourselves? Jean-Louis Cohen will tell us. In evaluating the origin of Roman cities, Joseph Reichert once claimed that the Roman who walked the Cardo knew that his walk was the axis around which the sun turned, and that if he followed the Decumanus, he was pursuing the sun's daily course. That's a fascinating exegesis of the now ubiquitous urban grid, whose connection to the sun's axis we have surely lost. Over the last century, this search for the next Cardo has become a more piecemeal endeavor, with a number of independent disciplines, economics, sociology, politics, and others, competing for primacy. Lewis Mumford, lamenting the predictable failure of one of the most promoted and enduring of these hypotheses, catalogs his disappointment with Marx. What did not take place in the revolutions of the 20th century was the fulfillment of the romantic fantasy of an instant revolution, a spontaneous transformation from which the new man or the new community or the new world would suddenly appear. Are Marx's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis still durable prognosticators? Or should we build our new history and locate our new world on the slopes of Vesuvius? Jean-Louis Cohen will tell us. Please welcome Jean-Louis Cohen to SCI-Arc.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm facing a fantastic challenge tonight, giving an interpretation of the history, the present, and the future of mankind. I will just try to look at some of these issues through the prism of a particular social, cultural, architectural phenomenon that is the skyscraper. I will not today, I will not, of course, give you a full history of the skyscraper, but discuss a few episodes in which we see how skyscrapers condense, reveal, and sometimes contradict social transformations that have shaped our civilization. I am starting with an obvious view, slightly demagogic one, but a view that brings us, I think, directly in the center of the discussion. It is not, it is rather difficult, and I'm alluding to an event we all know, not to see in the strike of Al-Qaeda in 2001 a highly symbolical moment in the chronicle of 100 years of modern high-rise construction. High-rise construction, of course, is not new. We know that skyscrapers are inserted in a history that starts with mythical buildings, the Tower of Babel, goes on with church towers, belfries, palazzi, metallic towers, etc. But skyscrapers are, of course, different. Skyscrapers hit by Al-Qaeda and skyscraper immune from any such adventures could be seen in the 20th century, and perhaps today again can be seen as condensing meaning. As skyscrapers here, the World Trade Center can be understood as a synecdoche, as a part representing the whole, as a synecdoche of New York, New York being itself a synecdoche of the US being a synecdoche of capitalism. History brings us extraordinary images that have a sort of prophetic relationship to what happened in 2001 in New York, and this will be my first historical slide in a series. Here, a collage by Russian constructivist Alexander Rodchenko, Future War in the Air, 1930. Rodchenko extends ideas that had been and representations that had been shaped, for instance, in Herbert J. Wells' book War in the Air. He represents in his collage that made 1 year after the great the Wall Street crash, a sort of class war at world scale. And here I want to insist on this relationship of the skyscraper and the war, as a relationship we can of course see in the ruins of Ground Zero. But here of course we see a war at the scale of the planet. But if we look at skyscrapers that still stand, that become even object of representation, objects of visual culture. Here, the Empire State Building, built in 1930, they can be related to war in a different way, in what I would call a positive way. War becomes a metaphor in the understanding of their making. The main contractor for the World Trade Center, Colonel William Starrett, published in 1928 a book called Skyscrapers and the Men Who Built Them, where he very clearly stated, building skyscrapers, I quote, is the nearest peacetime equivalent of war. The analogy to war is the strife against the elements. Foundations are planned away down in the earth alongside the towering skyscrapers already built. Water, quicksand, rock, and slimy clay bar our path to bedrock. Traffic rumbles in the crowded highway. In short, a fight with man-made problems. Yet, continues Starrett, it all runs smoothly and on time in accordance with a carefully prepared schedule. The service of supply in peacetime warfare, the logistics of building, and these men are the soldiers of a great creative effort. In short, skyscrapers represent the effect of a vast army of labor at work in the city. I would remind you that, seen in the opposite way, Walter Benjamin saw in war what he called the revenge of productive forces that were unleashed. So this relationship between war and production is one that can be discussed in many perspectives. If I return now to the chronicle of the skyscrapers, since the 1980s, when skyscrapers first appeared in Chicago, here we see two views of Chicago at the time of the 1893 Columbian Fair, we have to realize that series of scenes have shaped the history of the skyscraper, first in Chicago, then in other parts of America, then in Europe, then back to the US, then out to the Pacific Rim. And I want here to underline the meaning of this sequence of scenes. In Chicago around 1890, the terminology is not clearly established. Skyscrapers are often called, for instance, cloud pressers. The terminology will be developed in the later years. Skyscrapers emerged with the age of organization, with the development of white-collar employment, with insurance and financial companies, with also the development of a rental economy. They are as much a metaphor of capitalist competition as an expression of the programs these capitalist competitions needs in big central cities like the Loop in Chicago or downtown Manhattan. Very quickly, however, and this is something I want to a point I want to insist upon, the story of the skyscrapers becomes a transatlantic issue, even if Europe doesn't build anything close to skyscrapers before after World War I. As early as 1892, the students of the Paris École des Beaux-Arts had been invited to design an American beehive, une ruche américaine. As you know, perhaps the school, the École des Beaux-Arts, was the École's pedagogy was a system of competitions, and one of these competitions was funded by American alumni with incredibly radical programs that played a major role in the modernization of the schools. So we see on the left one of these projects by an architect called Bévière, with a fantasy of an American skyline and even a very small Indian bearing feathers, in all points faithful to the cliches of the Western literature of the times. We see how Haussmannian themes in both projects by Bévière and de Pert were developed and raised in a telescopic way above the ground. The skyscraper as a Beaux-Arts palazzo, this is exactly what was happening in downtown Manhattan on some lots. 1893, other French architects visit Chicago and bring back to France ideas about modest high-rise constructions, steel skeleton, open floor plans that lead the way to the one of the famous inventions of Le Corbusier, the free plan he discussed in the 1920s. This invention, the invention of a flexible building where partitions can be moved easily, takes place in the analysis of Chicago by people such as this architect here called Jacques Herman. But the American city is not simply, doesn't simply rise in the sky. The American city, as imagined in many projects between 1900 and 1914, here a project by Harvey Wiley Corbett, an architect whose contribution to the imagination of a modern city has been overlooked. These views here published in the French weekly L'Illustration in 1913 and very quickly published in all countries of Europe, these views would trigger the most radical views of the city, of the next city to come. One example is featured here in a drawing by Louis Bonnier, the head architect of the municipality of Paris, has Art Nouveau accents and is rather conservative and plain in its architectural expression, yet the idea of redeveloping the Paris Boulevard according to a system of deep platforms, connecting them with flat roof buildings that would be interrelated. This, of course, is very closely derived from the images published by Corbett, and the same is even more true with the urban dreams of Italian futurists. Here, Mario Chiattone's Bridge and Study of Volumes of 1914. Skyscrapers also very quickly, at least on paper, migrate to the east. And here I want to give you an example of how the Russian professional press would view the construction of skyscrapers in Chicago, the idea of a hanging facade on a skeleton, a facade that is built between the 12th and the 20th floor without any cladding on the lower floors. This extraordinary view for the time is known to the Russian professional audience. But for skyscraper, and this is quite an important issue also in the current debate, belongs both to high culture, to professional culture, to sophisticated interpretation, and also belongs to low culture, to popular culture. Another Russian example is this fascicle that shows us the skyscrapers seen from the outside. We see only the facade here. This is the Russian publication of the adventures of Nat Pinkerton, the king of detectives. Nat Pinkerton, Karol Sishikov. And here we have a nest of criminals under the skies. Maybe a very good definition of skyscrapers. Anyway, what I want to mean here is that the skyscraper is very quickly not only a technical answer to technical problems. It's not only a form that follows finance according to a quote of the Times and used as a title by Carol Willis in a small and very interesting book. The skyscraper is also very quickly mythical. And for very good reasons, skyscraper production begins, for instance, in New York as buildings for newspapers on Park Row, where the main dailies are printed. Skyscrapers are also developed in relationship with publicity. They belong to the age of media. And in a way, one could say that the technology that that requires skyscrapers, think of the Chicago Tribune competition of 1922, is perhaps more the printing press and mechanical photo reproduction of models that circulate the world than the elevator or the steel skeleton. So skyscrapers become part of urban spectacle. They become also part of a new visual culture. Here, Burnham's Flatiron building in New York, built in 1903, as seen by Stieglitz's photographic eye. Skyscrapers enter very quickly the media in as part of the chronicle of the heroism of record heights, and this is still, as we'll see later, an issue today. Who is building the highest one? For several years, Cass Gilbert's Woolworth building will be the highest, and here is shown in what is beginning to become a skyline, that is a new a new type of urban landscape. Very quickly also, this skyline becomes threatening. And here, the Equitable building in New York by Graham, Anderson, and Probst in 1915, a building that will trigger, because of the menace of its mass overshadowing the nearby buildings, the nearby lots. This menace of overshadowing skyscrapers has been very eloquently discussed by Frank Lloyd Wright in his rabid anti-New York and anti-skyscrapers writings. This building will trigger the transformation of the urban regulation in New York, will trigger the first three-dimensional urban regulation in 1916. And the next steps in the history of New York, here a famous photograph of Berenice Abbott of 1938, the next steps will be steps, that is, setbacks and new types of volumes in which in the city of laissez-faire, new types of regulation will be introduced to monitor and, to a certain degree, discipline the city of competition. One could say at this point that skyscrapers evolve between the order of the sublime, the very high, the very tall, the very massive for the skyscraper taken as a unit, and the order of the picturesque as soon as skyscrapers are massed together and evoke by their co-presence the space, the cramped space of a medieval city. Skyscrapers become also very quickly parts not only of visual culture but of literature. Henry James discovers them with awe when he returns to New York in his book The American Scene. Paul Bourget, French mondain novelist, mentions them returning from America and publishing his famous book Outre-mer in 1895. Paul Morand and many other writers from across the world discovering New York will devote to them many enthusiastic pages. Skyscrapers are captured by Europe after World War I. Already a discussion about high-rise construction in Berlin had started around 1910. The notion that in the age of organization, and the planning of Berlin was seen as centrally dominated not by palatial buildings but by the buildings of the organization, the need for high-rise buildings had been established before 1914 by many articles. So here we see the beginning of a story with the competition held on a triangle lot in front of the Friedrichstrasse station in the back, 1921. This is a recent model of the building of the Beehive, the project nicknamed Beehive by Mies Van der Rohe, famous project, a model which is infinitely better than the one shown at the exhibition of the Museum of Modern Art two years ago. The notion of the Hochhausstadt, of the vertical city, is developed in a much more radical way in Germany, at least in a virtual way, than in America. And after the Chicago scenes, where the skyscraper had been born, after the New York scene, Europe becomes the next scene. And here we see a cartoon, I think a very interesting cartoon for all sorts of reasons, discussing the contributions to the 1921 competition. Just look at this cluster of skyscrapers and at some of the ones that have been recently designed for Ground Zero in New York. It is clear that there is a sort of unself-conscious continuity. I won't discuss the relationship between this Babylonian accumulation and other types of buildings, but it's interesting to see that Frank Gehry's snakes that are low-rise buildings also evolve in the same realm. Mies Van der Rohe would design 1 year later yet more daring building, building in which he will foresee a new set of architectural perceptions dealing with the glass surfaces of the building. The skyscraper becoming not only a rational response to rational expectations, but becoming the origin of a new world of impressions, of sensations, of human experience. Compared to Mies's ideas, Adolf Loos' entry to the Chicago Tribune competition at the same moment, roughly, is clearly an extremely conservative and almost desperate attempt at handling these absolutely unruly new program with architecture's historical techniques. The tripartition between base, shaft, and crown and capital is here represented in what I would call a desperate way, in also a very ironic and almost cynical way by Adolf Loos. But what is clear here is that the radical discourse is at that time not an American one. American skyscrapers are despised by all the European radical architects. The discourse continues, and I will stay for a little longer in Europe. The discourse continues in Paris, for instance, with Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin of 1925, published here in a magazine, in a newspaper under the title, What if Paris would be Americanized? The 1920s are a period in which America has not only a symbolical but also a material and economic presence for the first time, and the skyscraper is identified with this hegemony. And here I want to risk a hypothesis about the development of skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are markers used in the conquest of legitimacy. They were used in emerging cities like Chicago and New York as expressions of a desire to become legitimate centers of power and perhaps also of culture. In Germany, defeated Germany after 1920, these competitions for high rises, no such thing in France. France had won the war, didn't need to fight anxiety with an outburst of architectural optimism. Germany needed that. So Le Corbusier, from his early designs onwards, tried to measure his project, here the contemporary city, with New York, and will fight a sort of solitary battle with New York during perhaps more than 25 years. Marges Bacon has very competently told us all the details of the story of this long story. Here we see the initial episodes, attempts at measuring order, symmetry, rationality versus the messy landscape of wild capitalism. At the same time, or a couple of years before, Auguste Perret, Le Corbusier's mentor, had initiated a series of imaginary studies on the theme of cities of towers. And here, I think there is a very striking sketch of the Perret's office on relating the skyscraper and the big ocean liner. And I think that we have here one of the major tropes of skyscraper thinking. The skyscraper is a vertical liner can be compared to large metallic constructions. We know that this parallel will be used by Le Corbusier, but it is more convincingly developed by Perret in these sketches of the early 20s. Le Corbusier returns to this idea when, in his Almanac of Modern Architecture of 25, he confronts Perret's sketch, a row of skyscrapers in Paris, a metallic building related with a harbor, with Mies's glass whorehouse on the left. Skyscrapers are also part of the dreams of the emerging Russian avant-garde. In 1923, the Frutemas, or that is the Russian equivalent of the Bauhaus, organizes a studio exercise on the theme of skyscrapers. 1923, Russia is not building anything. The country has burned many izbas during the years of the war and slightly later in order to heat the remaining ones. Here we see in the skyscraper, the dream of a skyscraper, a gesture of hope at that time. And here we see one project and another one, which is the base, as we can see, for SOM's, will be the base for SOM's CS Tower of 1974. What is interesting here, if we know that this building will trigger a sort of pale copy in Chicago, is that one of the ways the supporters of America were nicknamed in Russia in the 20s they were called the supporters of Americanism, but also of Chicagoism. A very, of course, in the Bolshevik regime, a very bad name. Being a Chicagoist was being, in a way, an agent of the enemy. But this didn't deter radical young architects to work on the theme of a skyscraper. Here, a glass box designed by Ivan Leonidov in 1930. Leonidov was one of the young and most radical constructivists, and we see how in one of his most abstract designs he managed to work on themes that are still totally contemporary. Here, the visible elevator on the outside, the sky lobby, the terrace on the top. We are dealing with themes that are present in current designs, as we'll see very briefly at the end of this talk. Skyscrapers also become the base of a new vision. In particular, when Erich Mendelsohn publishes his book America, the sketchbook of an architect in 1926, he presents these buildings no longer in a static way like Renaissance vedute, but in this dynamic worm's eye view. Here we see a view of the Equatable in New York as published in Mendelssohn's book, and the same photograph as republished by Rodchenko in one of his most famous articles, where Rodchenko view in this representation published by Mendelssohn, as opposed to previous static representations, the birth of a new vision. So skyscrapers were becoming instruments not only of a new experience, as I mentioned before, but clearly the testing ground of a new photographic and cinematographic vision. And this will be used, for instance, by the same Leonidov when in 1934 he will design this competition entry for a skyscraper on the Red Square. The Red Square, the St. Basil's Cathedral, and the building has represented exactly according to the visual pattern of Mendelssohn. Leonidov had the book of Mendelssohn in his hands. This has been quite clearly told to some of my colleagues by his son. Other Europeans are more regressive and are, in a way, seeing in the skyscraper more a nightmare than a dream. by Bonnier, the Paris architect from whom we saw the Boulevard project, here a view of future Paris with mega Woolworth building hovering over Notre Dame, clearly a nightmare. Other French architects build skyscrapers and identify them, setback skyscrapers, here in a suburb of Lyon called Villeurbanne. They take part not to the competition of capitalistic egos, but to the competition of mayors' egos. The suburban mayor trying to be braver as the mayor of a central city in the urban area by building higher structures. And from this moment onwards, in many contexts, European architects will focus on the culture of a skyscraper. They will try to export it to Latin America. Here, a beautiful rendering of Alfred Agache's plan for Rio de Janeiro in 1929, where the central square, Plaza do Comércio, is seen as circled by a sort of urban crown of Art Deco skyscrapers. The Cavanac building in Buenos Aires, 1936, by Jorge Calnay, expresses this local production of high-rises that condense, here it is a housing project that condense metropolitan life. After having traveled to Rome and Greece for decades, if not centuries, Beaux-Arts architects orient their grand tour towards the US. Here, a watercolor rendering of Camelot, a sort of pathetic attempt at rendering the energy of a building site with watercolors around 1932, the construction of the Rockefeller Center. Camelot would later become one of the head planners of La Défense in Paris. Here, by Milan architect Portaluppi, an ideal view of New York. We can recognize the Flatiron, here a view of the Woolworth building. Portaluppi designs this sort of hovering skyscraper as if these buildings were condensing a desire of New York, a desire of measuring oneself with New York. This is the framework in which Le Corbusier's discourse of 1935 can be inserted. When arriving in New York, he would try to minimize and to despise publicly the face of the city in order to claim the right to intervene and reshape the city. This attitude of looking down from the perspective of a European intellectual at America was not the first one. One of the most notorious one was the Attitude of Mayakovsky in 1925, a Russian futurist poet, arriving in New York and finding New York skyscraper too tame and too decorated and not up to the expectations of the European avant-garde. Le Corbusier's work on the skyscraper will be totally focused by his discovery of New York. This is here the original model of the skyscraper he designed between 38 and 40 for Algiers, in which he completely breaks with the notion of a glass tower and rediscovers values of expression of tectonics after having visited New York and after having found how the eclectic cladding of New York skyscraper was irrelevant. This is, by the way, one of the first buildings in which certain notion of sustainability can be found through. This is on this building Le Corbusier tested, thanks to the developments of these projects made by Brazilian architects in Rio with the Ministry of Education, he tested the concept of the brise-soleil, of the sun protection that would later become a trademark of his post-war architecture. So the skyscraper triggered this idea and contributed to this experimentation in his work. We're coming closer to more stranger connections. The skyscraper was so popular as an expression, as a symbol of modernization, that the totalitarian regimes of the 1930s very quickly embraced it. Here we see an almost Corbusian building with a little bird on its base above the door. The bird is not a chicken, but a Nazi eagle. And the project is by Otto Kotz, a Berlin architect, who sees and proposes to the Nazi leaders the construction of a high-rise Berlin in 1945 on this photomontage, and again for the competition for the university city in 1948. These buildings bear a very strange resemblance to the ones of the Moscow University, the central part, at least, built, and perhaps have had some impact. The Russians also rethink the question of high-rise constructions. In 1926, when the constructivist avant-garde was thinking of a very rapid and energetic reconstruction of daily life, a skyscraper has been understood by Pasternak, a radical architect, as the real social condenser of the future. And this view is one of the views that has been very brilliantly discussed by Rem Koolhaas in his Delirious New York, in his attempts to link programmatic experiments of the Russians and the ones of Americans in New York. But at the end of the 1930s, the question is totally different. The attitude is different. The skyscraper is no longer viewed as a system, but simply as a structure, and the goal of a regime becomes to surpass American skyscrapers by introducing in this crazy project, unbuildable project for the Palace of Soviets, to surpass these buildings by introducing a sort of pantheon under the skeleton of the New York skyscraper. With World War II architects become dreaming again also in Europe. Construction in the meantime has totally stopped in the US, and big teams of the officers that were building skyscrapers until the early 30s have been disbanded, and the most radical projects at that time come up in Europe. Not always very radical aesthetically, but at least very daring. Here, a project for a 300 meters tower at La Défense by Jacques Carlu, who had built the Palais de Chaillot and would later become a quite active monumental builder. Perret returns to his idea of a city of tower, and here we see one of his drawings for the reconstruction of Le Havre, and we meet one of the fantasies of European rulers and European architects altogether, the notion of presenting to travelers coming from America European skyscrapers, the idea that you come with the Normandy and discover that France also has high rises. Until 1942, for instance, a project had been developed for the city of Hamburg with the very same idea, the concept of a Führerbau, a big building devoted to the Führer, that would have greeted travelers coming from America. The architect was, I don't have a slide here, the architect was Konstantin Guccio, and the engineer Fritz Leonhardt, an architect who had been in America and who would later become a major, and is still alive, the major German engineer of the post-war times. And let me return for last time before jumping across several decades to the Russian scene. The Russians had dreamed of a skyscraper in the age of the avant-gardes. They returned to this question in the late 1930s and discuss the messy skyline of Manhattan. Here we see a view published in the major town planning handbook published by Bunin in Moscow in 1940, with the notion that skyscrapers are not properly organized. They are messy. The skyline of Manhattan is the product of competition and egoistic moves by the builders. This is not a neat, ordered composition. In order to do a neat composition, this is the plan of 1946 for a network of skyscrapers in Moscow, the Palace of Soviets, still in the making, very soon to be dropped, the university and a set of other buildings. The scheme was to be another American scheme by Hugh Ferris, published in his Metropolis of Tomorrow of 1929. We have this notion that the city should be organized according to specialized centers, a center of learning, a center of science, a center of business, each featured as a towering building. This is exactly what is implemented by the Russian Center of Learning with the university, Center of Diplomacy with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, Center of Business with a building devoted to industry, and some lower residential structures. The Russians built these so-called high-rise buildings. Skyscraper is considered as being a capitalistic term, and this is one of the best ones, one of the best designed ones on the Moscow River, a building which has very interesting history. There has been a beautiful publication of social history discussing it, and a film discussing it, the personal history of many of its inhabitants from Stalin's time to this day. So the idea of restructuring the city with these markers is extremely obvious in this set of buildings. The presence of America is also obvious. Here we see the building on Vostania Square, where pieces here these two bookends seem to have been derived from the RCA building at the Rockefeller Center. We see another view of the same building, built finally around 1954, sorry. And the last view shows us that how much skyscrapers, also in Stalin's Russia, were part of an effort to strike imagination and to construct the notion of a sort of collective effort. These views of builders in the sky, of course, relate to photos of New York skyscraper sites in the 1930s, the famous photographs of Louis Hine, for instance. Clearly, the desire of becoming a new world, this is what futurist poets had written. Alexander Bloch had written eloquently before 1914 a poetry called Novaya America, New America, the notion that a new world would appear in Russia, either radical, innovative, or monumental and slightly oppressive, to say the least. With Stalin's later policies, was once again based on a sort of lonely battle with America, in which skyscrapers were to become weapons. Skyscraper construction resumes and becomes again extremely innovative on a modernized New York scene in the 1950s. No need to comment on these buildings. Mies is finally able at implementing his ideas of the 1920s, first with housing buildings in New York and then in Chicago, and then with the Seagram building. The answer of SOM on the other side of Park Avenue is an elegant and slightly futile one, but one which is extremely competent and interesting with level building. The next steps would happen in many other parts of the world, in Europe also, with, for instance, the Pirelli or the Torre Velasca in Milan, in Chicago with Bertrand Goldberg's Marina Towers. In Chicago again, when SOM will return to the concept of will use the concept of visible exterior bracing in the Hancock Tower. Unfortunately, the skyscrapers will then become a victim of the postmodernist discourse, and this episode is too sad to be told here today. I don't want to mention Johnson's unfortunate buildings, from AT&T to its Pittsburgh plate glass, or even worse, his Republic Bank in a sort of neo-Hanseatic style in Houston. This was clearly an abyssal moment in the history of skyscrapers and architecture, in which the desire to re-cementize the buildings led to pitiful results. And I don't want to, I've never liked these buildings, I don't want to comment upon them today. I just to remind you another view of SOM's production at that time. You remember the Frutemas buildings. There were people who knew them in SOM's office. I haven't investigated with precision, but they had been republished at that time, and so this is the reverse homage of American corporate architecture to Russian inventivity of the 1920s. From the early 80s onwards, a new scene emerges. This scene is a multiple scene located on the Pacific Rim that includes Los Angeles, but I don't think that there are extremely interesting skyscrapers in Los Angeles, so I won't mention them today. Sorry, we're waiting for them, or not. The Pacific Rim will become the stage for skyscrapers for very good reasons. Of course, economic development, of course, pressure of real estate, like in the case of Hong Kong and other cities, and Tokyo. Certainly there were objective reasons, but the real reasons were elsewhere, were in the struggle for legitimacy and symbolic hegemony. For instance, the competition between Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank and Pei's Bank of China, symbolizing the return of mainland China as an economic power in Hong Kong, had to do with the conquest of legitimacy, in which skyscrapers are used as gigantic pieces of a chess game at the scale of the planet. So once again, Hong Kong as a stage where extremely interesting innovation takes place. And here I want to underline the importance, the meaning. It appears every day more, of Norman Foster, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank of 1986, not in the beginning of a concern for sustainable development in the recycling of water, not only for the suspension of the floors, but essentially because of the concept of a hollow tower, an idea that had been developed in a lower building, for instance, by Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin building in 1903, but also by Jean Prouvé, the French builder, in an unbuilt project for La Défense. So here, an extremely daring project, and the newer projects in Hong Kong, such as the Kowloon MTR Tower by SOM, planned for 2000X, perhaps 5 or 6, a building which supposedly will be the highest one on the planet at 574 meters, breaking the record of Pelly's Petronas Towers. It is clear that here we are dealing with a building that might be innovative in some of its technical features, but a building that will that is not bringing the same typological inventivity as Foster's. Here, Pelli's Petronas Towers, where exactly the same thing could be said. The invention is not typological, spatial. We are facing a sort of hybrid between high technology and postmodernism, a position we can see also in the work of architects like a forgotten Catalan guy called Ricardo Bofill, who had his hour of glory 20 years ago, and who is trying to recycle his ideas about decoration inside glass boxes. So there is today a very strong trend in skyscrapers construction, which is in a way trying to reconcile the decorative and the structural. The most, I think, spectacular and interesting ideas come when the traditional view and division of a skyscraper is challenged. And this happened with Norman Foster. This happened also with Future Systems. In the mid-80s, this project pasted against the ground a photo of Manhattan as if, once again, like with Le Corbusier or Mies, New York was the ultimate, as a background, the ultimate setting for new thinking. This project of a skyscraper with tensile structures and very large patios up in the air is, of course, a critique of a stony, massive or cold boxes built before, and a critique of decorative postmodernism. From these projects, more realistic endeavors have been developed. So here, Norman Foster, Commerzbank in Frankfurt of 1997, a very clever building through its connection to the ground, but also an interesting building through the provision of sky lobbies and an interesting one in its use of, in its energetic thinking, in its view of sustainable development. Here, I would, however, be slightly critical. Pretending to build sustainable buildings when you invest such a capital and such technology in a single building sounds to me a little strange. And could be compared in a way, maybe I'm exaggerating my point, but when I read that Arnie was painting one of his Humvees in green, or was converting one of his Humvees to natural fuel, I have the same feeling. These buildings are painted green, but if they have to be seen in a more global view of the planet, it is clear that their sustainability is extremely limited. Skyscrapers are also an exercise today in design, an exercise in minimalism. This is a sort of stellar designed by Dominique Perrault for the new Diagonal in Barcelona. Rather thin, slim slab with a cantilever. So the game is in the cantilever, and the building itself will be a sort of cold addition to Barcelona's skyline. We can contrast to this coldness and this view of this transfer of minimal art into architecture, projects, unbuilt projects by Frank Gehry are like, for instance, is the New York Times entry, which was a very interesting attempt at liberating the curtain wall from its slavery, in letting it climb and become a sort of torch in the sky of New York. A very interesting project. The project selected by the New York Times by Renzo Piano is much less heroic, but nonetheless, in the context of New York, will be the first really innovative building in years, with a facade protected by ceramic sunshades, I think a very interesting technical system at the service of a rather conservative overall shape. Piano will also probably build the London Bridge Tower in London, a building in which he has developed, he is continuing to develop these daring technologies. Here, by the way, I want to insist on one thing. I have left aside the question of the relationship of the skyscraper and the urban infrastructure, and it is clear that Piano's tower cannot be seen as the lonely skyscraper which has been built by many narcissistic middle towns in Europe and beyond, but has to be seen as the marker of a very dense hub of infrastructure, as it is always the case. So the skyscraper, we shouldn't forget, is the strict contemporary of the subways or the elevated railways. Los Angeles is an exception, and the damage inflicted upon downtown Los Angeles by the problem of servicing the skyscrapers or the downtown business center with the freeways has been terrible, because skyscrapers are meant to be related to subways and not to freeways. Okay, the competition for the highest towers has continued ever since Frank Lloyd Wright dreamed of a mile-high skyscraper. Here, Foster's Millennium Tower project of 1997, a multi-use tower with a rather narrow footprint in Tokyo's Bay and a height of more than 800 meters. A theoretical project, like many in the history of this building type. S1's project for South Dearborn in Chicago, in the same family of extremely thin structure in which the central core, the central mast, the central cylinder, and then cantilevered structure is used. We are far from the early frame structure and going toward more solid tubular structures. The World Trade Center's tragedy having also introduced new thinking in this area. Here, the building that will become Europe's tallest in the next years, the Parkhaven building in Rotterdam by KPF, twisted tower, which is a mixed-use building with a double skin and a tubular structure. Here, finally, a last project by Norman Foster, the Swiss Re in London, a building in which aerodynamics and the use of sophisticated computerized technology bring again the skyscraper closest not to the palazzo and to the culture of building, as was the case with postmodernism, but back to the world of ocean liners. Here, I think, never the skyscraper in the previous decades had been so close to the concept of a machine as in this one. The skyscraper also becomes an exercise in illusion and perception. This is at least what Jean Nouvel tries to do in his project. This unbuilt project, the Tower of the Infinites, in designed for La Défense in 1988, is an extremely interesting one, a very slim and perhaps not very profitable cross-section, a building without any central core, but with a load-bearing facade, a building playing on a change of color and a change of perception from the darker lower floor to lighter upper floors that would fuse and merge with the sky. A very beautiful project with a complex interior structure that was finally dropped. Nouvel is completing these days in Barcelona the Akbar Tower, the building of the Barcelona Water Company, another attempt at playing with perception. The building has a very interesting colored glass skin on a concrete, on a continuous concrete wall, and beyond its phallic dimension, very clear and very very candid, I think introduces, I think, a very strong point in serving as a point of reflection, as a surface of reflection for the Catalan capital. You remember the image of Courbet's vertical city of 1912 or 1913. The vertical city has returned with projects such as Hiroshi Ara's Umeda Sky Building in Osaka of 1993. The notion of buildings that develop horizontally, that are connected, has been very present in the reflection of many architects these last days. If we look, this is a lousy slide taken from a website of Rem Koolhaas's project for the central Chinese television in Beijing, a project to be completed in 2006, designed with Cecil Balmont of Over Arabs. Here we see again the notion of a building that is not only a vertical element, but that has a broader potential to frame literally urban vision. At the same time, it is a very complex and dynamic structure where the bracing is not the static bracing of, for instance, the Hancock Tower, but plays a role in the in balancing the cantilever of the building. The stage, the scene, a scene which had seemed at some moment to be totally displaced to Asia, is returning to New York. Projects such as the New York Times had been started already before 9/11, and 9/11 has triggered, of course, a new wave of thinking in relationship with Yamazaki's rather boring towers. So if we look at the buildings, and here I'm using self-consciously images that were a little exaggerated in their colors, as shown in the press of Libeskind's project. If we look at all these projects, after having seen the long chronicle and a very partial, a very, I think, perhaps sectarian one of what has happened in 120 years of skyscrapers construction, one sees many attempts, many expectations, and also many simplifications. Libeskind's project is all about semantics, and once the big boys will be brought, and they are coming now to the building site, the semantics will probably be left aside. They had been extremely useful to win the job. I think that the end of this project will be extremely cynical, and that not a lot will remain of these ambitions to once again work with the skyscrapers to commemorate, to symbolize, to condense meaning. The other projects of these years of late 2002, early 2003 competition were much less semanticized and worked simply on the reproduction of a skyscraper spare in a very competent and very buildable form, with a slim and realistic project of Foster Associates. They were bringing back the notion of the city in the sky with its horizontal connections in the project of United Architects. I think this was one of the most interesting development in the entire competition, one of the most promising to some extent. The bridge returns also with the skyways in the project of Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, and their teams. And finally, the dream of a framework in the sky, letting, in a way, keeping in the completed building the dynamism of the building site, that is keeping the tension of what Starrett called, in the quote I read, the skyscraper as war, the skyscraper as a sort of intense collective effort, was captured in the project of the Think team with Raphael Vignoli and Frederick Schwartz. I must say here that I have trouble defining myself in respect to these various projects, and I'm still dreaming now post factum of a more dynamic, more open, more imaginative procedure, but it is probably too late. And my last slide is this one. I wanted to evoke this popular memorial to 9/11 in order to say that beyond or besides the official history, the professional history of skyscrapers, there should be another one to be written, the history of the inscription of skyscrapers in popular culture, and not only in times of crisis, in times of drama. In a way, skyscrapers remain what I would call a total social fact. I use here the term of sociologist and anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who uses the notion of total social fact to describe institution and their material base. Skyscrapers deal with economic, social infrastructure, as well as with the cultural, what can be called the cultural superstructure. And here, of course, they relate with much more than that. Perhaps now the real emblems of power in our world, in a world where political institutions are now modest in their monumental expression, at least skyscrapers condense our fears. They also sometimes remain markers of our optimism. Thank you. Okay. Okay.